They told me I was the future of the company. They said I brought fresh perspective, global insight, and diversity value. But 3 months ago, my boss looked me in the eye smiling and said the words I will never forget. "We hired you for optics, Sophia. Don't get ideas." That sentence ended everything I thought I knew about this company and began something else entirely. Because what Victoria Lane didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that I wasn't just some smiling brown face she could parade in front of the board during equity reviews. I wasn't a checkbox on her ESG report, and I sure as hell wasn't going to stay quiet after she bulldozed 18 months of partnerships that I had poured my soul into, relationships that fed families, supported villages, and held entire communities together. You see, Victoria thought she was cutting dead weight. What she actually did was pull the trigger on a legal trap I'd spent nearly 2 years building, one clause, one contract, one quiet conversation at a time. And within 72 hours of her smug little power play, the company's $100 million deal, her baby, her pride, her upcoming press release, imploded from the inside. Not with noise, not with drama, just silence. The kind of silence that makes executives panic. The kind of silence that shuts down entire factories. The kind of silence that only comes when the people you've underestimated for years finally decide not to play nice anymore. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told you were lucky to be in the room, this story is for you. Because I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't fight. I documented. I built. And I waited. So if you want to know how I turned every insult, every condescending comment, and every boardroom dismissal into the perfect weapon, keep listening. Because the woman they once called the quiet one from procurement just brought an entire tech empire to its knees. My name is Sophia Reyes. I was born in El Paso, Texas, but I wasn't raised in boardrooms or behind glass walls. I was raised behind the counter of a small dry cleaning shop, watching my mother hem pants for men who wouldn't make eye contact with her. She came to this country with a sewing kit and a spine of steel. She worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, never took a vacation, and never asked for anything she didn't earn. English was her second language, but kindness was always her first. And for a long time, I thought hard work was enough to protect you. Until the day I watched her come home in silence. No words. No tears, just quiet. Her jawbone she'd held for 8 years had been eliminated. Departmental restructuring, they called it. But what they didn't say out loud was the part everyone knew. She was too old, too brown, too soft, spoken to fit their new image. She lost her health insurance that day, her retirement fund, her pride. And I lost something too. I lost faith in the system. But I didn't lose the will to change it. From that moment forward, I studied like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. I got a scholarship to the University of Texas, graduated with honors in supply chain economics, and took every job no one else wanted. I worked graveyard shifts in freight warehouses. I negotiated with customs officials in 3 languages. I rebuilt collapsed inventory systems in underfunded districts. And with every project, every late night, every impossible deadline, I became the person they couldn't ignore even if they still didn't fully see me. I never wore flashy suits. I didn't network at rooftop parties. But I watched. I learned. And I remembered. Remembered what it felt like to be the daughter of a woman who had everything taken from her without cause or apology. Remembered how the people in power smiled while cutting others down. Remembered that behind every profit margin, there were human beings, people who didn't have the luxury of being seen as assets, just liabilities to reduce. So when I landed the position at Everstate, an up-and-coming tech firm in Austin, something clicked. The company looked shiny on the outside, diversity panels, equity pledges, statements about empowerment. But behind closed doors, it was business as usual. People like me were hired to decorate the idea of progress, not to drive it. And then there was Victoria Lane. She was the kind of executive that made headlines for the right reasons and decisions for all the wrong ones. She spoke about justice in interviews and wielded power like a guillotine in meetings. Her smile was corporate. Her promises were performative. And I knew, within the first month, that this wasn't going to be a career. This was going to be a test. And I was done failing tests built by people like her. So I smiled. I said yes. I nodded through condescension. And behind that silence, I began to build. Not just a resume. Not just a department. But a system. A network of relationships powerful enough to challenge every assumption they had about women like me. That's who I am. Not a diversity hire. Not a quiet girl from El Paso. I am Zofia Reyes. And I don't forget what you take from people like my mother. I was 9 the first time I saw my mother cry. Not the kind of crying that comes from a sad movie or a stubbed toe. The kind of crying that's soundless. That sits heavy in the air. That tastes like metal in your mouth and makes you afraid to ask what's wrong. She was standing at the kitchen sink, still wearing her work apron. Her hands were trembling, the same hands that sewed my school uniforms, packed my lunches, fixed every broken zipper and torn seam like magic. But that night, she looked small, like the weight of something invisible had finally bent her spine. I didn't understand what restructured meant back then. All I knew was that she came home 3 hours early, without groceries, without the smile she usually faked for my sake. She tried to pretend nothing had happened. She told me she was just tired. But I heard the silence stretching between her words. I heard the way her voice cracked when I asked if we'd still be able to buy shoes for my school recital. The truth came out 2 days later accidentally when she left a folder on the kitchen table. I opened it, thinking it was bills. But inside were 2 things I'll never forget. A letter that started with, "We appreciate your service, but..." and a check. Not even a full paycheck. A severance so small it wouldn't cover half our rent. That night, I learned a lesson most kids don't learn until they're much older. That hard work doesn't always protect you. That being good isn't always enough. And that the people who smile to your face can still take everything from you without blinking. Over the next few months, I watched her unravel in slow motion. She canceled her doctor's appointments. She stopped buying the fancy fabric she loved to sew with. She started saying things like, maybe I should have just stayed in Juarez, even though she'd worked so hard to give us a life across the border. There was no lawsuit, no outcry, no story in the paper. Just a woman who got erased because someone higher up decided she was no longer useful. And I carried that silence with me. Every time I was talked over in a classroom. Every time I was the only brown girl in an honors seminar. Every time someone told me I was well-spoken, like it was a surprise. I carried it through my teenage years, through scholarships and part-time jobs and the feeling that I had to be twice as prepared just to be allowed in the room. And when I got older, I realized something even darker. That what happened to my mother wasn't personal. It was systemic, intentional, and so quiet that no one even noticed it happened, except the people it happened to. That's when I stopped waiting for the system to change, and started planning how to outlive it. So yes, when Victoria Lane gave me that polished smile and said I was a great fit for Everstate's diversity vision, I smiled back. Because I knew she didn't see me as a threat. She saw me as a symbol, a decoration, a token. And I knew, in that moment, that I had all the time in the world. Because what she didn't know is that I'd already lived the fallout. And this time, I would be the one writing the severance letter. There's something they never tell you about becoming strong. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no montage, no soundtrack, no flash of lightning. It happens in the quiet, in the nights no one sees, in the work no one claps for, in the spaces where your name is forgotten and your presence is convenient. That's where I became dangerous. After my mother lost everything, I didn't get angry not the way people expect. I didn't scream or throw punches at the world. I got methodical. I made a list of every skill they said people like us didn't have. English fluency? I memorized news transcripts until I could mimic every inflection. Public speaking? I joined debate clubs where no one looked like me and learned to hold my own. Negotiation? I studied transcripts from union standoffs and shadowed warehouse foremen who'd been squeezing margins for 20 years. I didn't just want to survive in the system that erased my mother. I wanted to understand every bolt of it so I could dismantle it from the inside. At the University of Texas, I majored in global logistics. Not because it sounded glamorous, it didn't. Most people didn't even know what it meant. But I did. Supply chains are the veins of every company. Quiet, underestimated, essential. Exactly like the people they so often ignore. So I took jobs no one else wanted. Night shift in a frozen seafood distributor in Laredo. Temp assistant in a textile factory in Louisiana. Freight clerk at a border customs warehouse where I got cussed out in 3 languages before 9 a.m. Each place taught me something. How systems really move. How policies on paper look nothing like the ground-level truth. How the people who hold up the world are almost never invited to its decision-making tables. And while I worked, I watched. I watched which vendors got cut first when budgets shrank. I watched which accents triggered sudden doubt in meetings. I watched how kindness was dismissed as weakness, and how cruelty got promoted. I took notes. I kept receipts. And I learned how to smile without showing my teeth. Because I knew my time would come. Not through luck, not through charity, but through strategy. By the time I joined Everstate, I already had 5 years of experience across 3 continents. I'd negotiated in Jakarta, solved customs crises in Buenos Aires, and built partnerships in Manila strong enough to withstand typhoons and trade wars. But when I walked into my first meeting with the Everstate executive team, all they saw was a promising young Latina hire. That's fine. Let them underestimate me. Let them nod when I spoke, then ignore my suggestions 5 minutes later. Let them assume I was there to smile at interns and organize potlucks. Because what they didn't know was that every smile I gave was calculated. Every task I took was data. Every relationship I built was a future contingency. I wasn't just doing my job. I was mapping the exits. So that, when they pulled the same stunt they did with my mother, I wouldn't be powerless. I'd be ready. Everstate didn't look like a battlefield when I first walked in. It looked like a dream. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Open concept workspaces with meditation corners and kombucha on tap. Framed mission statements about impact, innovation, and inclusive growth. Every hallway was filled with buzzwords and optimism. But I knew better. The most dangerous places aren't the ones that look broken. They're the ones that look perfect on the surface while the rot grows underneath. Still, I smiled. Wore the blazer. Shook the hands. When Victoria Lane walked into that interview room, she barely looked at my resume before saying, "You have an impressive background, and we're really excited about expanding our supplier partnerships in emerging regions." Emerging regions. That was her phrase. She meant anywhere, not America. Not white, not convenient. She said it with a rehearsed warmth, the kind you hear from politicians shaking hands with people they don't plan to remember. She liked me instantly not because of who I was, but because of what I represented. A bilingual Latina woman with a degree in global logistics? I was a diversity dream. Someone she could put on panels, in brochures, on the website. But behind that performative kindness, I recognized something colder. Victoria wasn't just powerful, she was calculated. She built her image around the illusion of progress, but every major decision she made still prioritized proximity, profit, and control. To her, people like me were symbols, not strategists. Certainly not threats. That's why she hired me. And that's why I accepted. Because Everstate wasn't just another company. It was the perfect stage. They were about to expand their global supply chain to prepare for a $100 million contract with a government tech consortium. Victoria needed someone to soften suppliers in countries she didn't care to understand. Someone who could speak the languages, navigate cultural nuances, and make her policies look human. I played that role flawlessly. In meetings, I was thoughtful but never confrontational. In negotiations, I was firm but never emotional. In front of her, I stayed 2 steps behind. But behind her, I was 10 steps ahead. I visited family-run manufacturing plants in rural Vietnam. I sat with farmers in central Colombia who were integrating solar logistics into their shipping routes. I worked with women-led packaging firms in Lagos who had survived 2 recessions and were still innovating faster than our domestic competitors. I didn't just collect contracts. I collected stories. I listened. I remembered. I built something Victoria never anticipated: trust. And while she updated her LinkedIn with quotes about inclusion, I negotiated deals that required real-world accountability. Embedded inside those contracts quietly, carefully, were terms Victoria never questioned. Clauses about mutual notification, collective withdrawal, penalty escalations tied not to late shipments, but to unethical terminations. She never read them. She just saw savings. She saw headlines, bonuses, the next step on her ladder. And I let her, because Everstate gave me access. Access to systems, to decision makers, to the vulnerabilities no one in power ever thought someone like me would notice. This wasn't just a job. It was a map. And slowly, clause by clause, handshake by handshake, I was laying the foundation for a reckoning. It started with a smile. It always does. Victoria walked into the Monday leadership meeting with a kind of manufactured cheer in her voice, like she was delivering good news before anyone had the chance to question it. Starting next quarter, she announced, we'll be consolidating all external vendor contracts into a domestic first model. Her tone was light. Her words weren't. I knew what that meant. I knew who that would affect. And I knew, by the way she avoided looking in my direction, that she knew too. At first, it was framed as strategy. We need more control over our supply chain. Time zones are creating inefficiencies. Domestic partners will reduce compliance risks. But those were just excuses. The truth? She was cutting ties with every non-American supplier because it made her life easier. Less communication, less nuance, less accountability, fewer accents, fewer questions, fewer people she had to pretend to respect. The first contract she canceled was with a textile manufacturer in Nigeria, woman-run company that had doubled its output just to meet Everstate's volume. Victoria called it a necessary streamlining. No warning, no notice. Next was a Colombian glassworks co-op we'd partnered with for sustainable packaging. Victoria dismissed it as too unstable politically, even though their delivery record had been flawless. Then came the precision tooling team in Malaysia, the agriculture tech supplier in Thailand, the semiconductor partners in rural Taiwan. All gone, one after another. Like falling dominoes, except this time, they weren't falling randomly. She was pushing them, deliberately. And all the while, she kept saying the same thing in different ways. It's not personal. It's just business. These are legacy contracts. It's time for modernization. But what she meant was, they don't matter. Any two. What she didn't realize, what she never bothered to realize, is that every one of those partners had a face, a family, a story, a handshake with me, a belief that this company, for once, might actually be different. I tried once to raise the alarm gently. I sat down with her after a review and said, some of these suppliers can't be replaced easily. They've built custom systems around our specs. We're not just buying parts, we're buying decades of trust. She laughed. Actually laughed. Then looked at me and said, Sophia, you're thinking like a relationship manager. This is procurement, not a nonprofit. And then came the words that shifted everything. Let's stop pretending these foreign vendors are irreplaceable. They should be grateful we gave them a shot at all. In that moment, I felt something inside me lock into place. Because it wasn't just short-sighted. It was cruel. And arrogant. And familiar. It was the same tone I'd heard from the manager who fired my mother. The same dismissiveness masked in corporate language. The same assumption that certain types of people only belonged in the supply chain if they knew how to stay invisible. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, is that every one of those suppliers had signed contracts with language buried deep in the fine print. Language she never bothered to read. Language I had personally crafted. And with every cancellation she made, she was stepping closer to the edge. Smiling. Oblivious. Confident that the world bent around her decisions. But soon, very soon, she was going to find out what happens when the people you treat as disposable decide not to be quiet anymore. People think revenge is loud, that it looks like shouting in boardrooms or flipping tables or storming out dramatically to the sound of gasps. But the real kind, the kind that lasts, is quiet. It looks like nodding in agreement while someone talks down to you. It sounds like, "Yes, ma'am, I'll get that finalized today." And it feels like signing a contract with just a few extra lines they'll never bother to notice. While Victoria was busy playing empire builder, cutting ties, making speeches, calling our international partners expendable, I was busy doing something else. I was building the fuse, clause by clause. It started simple. In the early stages of negotiation, I'd suggest standard protective language and nothing aggressive, nothing that would raise eyebrows. Given the volatility of past international relationships, I'd explain gently. We've found it helpful to include mutual withdrawal provisions, just to offer our suppliers a sense of stability and shared leverage. Victoria never read the legal inserts. She never asked questions. She just saw reduced costs and signed off. I buried the key language in the middle of multi-page contracts. In the event of termination of other international supply agreements without cause, partner reserves the right to withdraw from contract without penalty with immediate effect. Legal skimmed it. Operations glanced at it. Victoria didn't even look. But the suppliers did. I made sure of that. I spoke with them direct on-site visits, over video calls, even during layovers in quiet terminals. I never said Victoria's name. I never made promises I couldn't back. I just told them the truth. That corporations are quick to forget the people who keep them running. That partnerships only work when both sides have power. That sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to be ready to leave before you're pushed. And they listened. Because they'd all seen it before. They'd watched Western companies swoop in with promises and leave with patents. They'd watched entire communities rise and fall on the whims of executives who didn't know how to pronounce their last names. So when I offered them contracts with escape routes not just for their benefit, but for mutual protection, they understood immediately. These weren't suppliers looking for handouts. These were survivors. Business owners who had weathered political coups, market crashes, natural disasters, and still met every shipment on time, every order with pride. They weren't just signing contracts with Everstate. They were signing with me. And what Victoria didn't understand, what she never understood, was that trust is a currency more valuable than capital. For 18 months, I built those relationships in silence. I let her take credit for the cost savings. I let her brag about how streamlined our supply chain had become. I even let her call me her quiet rock star, the one who got things done without drama. But what I was really doing was laying foundation, like weaving steel wires into the base of a glass castle. She thought she was building something invincible. She had no idea she was standing on a minefield I designed. And when she finally triggered it, when she cut those first few contracts, with that smug little shrug of indifferences, lit the fuse herself. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to wait. Because silence, when chosen carefully, is the sharpest blade. It happened on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are funny like that. They sneak up on you with the illusion of normalcy, midweek rhythm, coffee just strong enough, inbox manageable. But that Tuesday was different. I was called into Victoria's office for what she said would be a routine review. Her voice was light, her tone almost performative. When I stepped in, she didn't look up, just gestured toward the seat across from her and continued typing with a kind of casual authority that only comes from someone who believes they can't be touched. Her monitor displayed a long list of vendor names I knew by heart, names I'd built with care, relationships that had taken months, sometimes years, to nurture. A Vietnamese polymer company, a family-run glassworks in Portugal, Miguel Santos' precision tooling firm in Querétaro. I knew all of them. Victoria hit delete like she was swiping lint off her sleeve. These international vendors, she said, still typing, too slow, too sensitive, too complicated. We're moving everything to US-based suppliers next quarter. Faster turnaround. Fewer culture issues. He blinked. Some of those contracts are bound by mutual clauses. Immediate terminations might. She raised a hand dismissive, final. Legal will figure it out, she said. They're lucky we gave them business at all. End quote. Then she smiled and said the 7 words I will never forget. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. The fuse lit, quietly, unseen, but absolute. I nodded, said thank you, walked out of her office without a word. But instead of heading to my desk, I went straight to the stairwell, found the farthest corner, and pulled out my phone. The first call was to Miguel in Mexico, then Bao in Vietnam, then the Glassworks team in Porto. I didn't have to explain much, just enough for them to understand that the clause we'd all hoped we'd never use was now live. And then came the ripple. Miguel called his cousin's firm in Taiwan. Bao messaged her partners in rural Thailand. The Porto team reached out to our solar packaging supplier in Colombia. Within 12 hours, the network was moving like a system that had been designed not just to function, but to defend itself. No chaos, no shouting, just a series of emails, perfectly timed, perfectly aligned. By Wednesday morning, the emails hit. Per Clause 9.3, we are exercising our right to withdraw effective immediately. Per Article 12b, operations will cease until further notice. Due to upstream contract termination, our facility is suspending all current shipments. I watched from my desk as Everstate's operations dashboard turned from green to yellow to red. Phones started ringing. Supervisors scrambling. Procurement trying to understand why nothing was arriving. Victoria didn't notice at first. She was too busy prepping a media piece about streamlined domestic strategy and patting herself on the back in meetings. By Thursday afternoon, our production floor was silent. Not from protest. Not from strikes. Just nothing. No materials. No shipments. No parts. 68% of our active contracts had gone dark. At once. By Friday, our biggest client, a tech defense group expecting a shipment tied to government funding, called to express serious concern. Victoria called it a temporary disruption. I called it what it was. Consequence. She hadn't just underestimated our partners. She'd underestimated me. She'd built her empire on control. And she never thought the girl she hired for diversity optics would be the one who handed the entire empire back to its foundation. Cracked, hollow, and already crumbling. It didn't take long. By Friday morning, Everstate looked calm from the outside, just another tech campus under the Texas sun, but inside, it was unraveling. The manufacturing dashboard was frozen. Client service reps were fielding furious calls they had no answers for. Executives paced in hallways that suddenly felt too quiet. And Victoria? She was still clinging to her narrative. This is a short-term pivot, she told the team. We're simply adjusting our vendor strategy to better align with domestic priorities. But there was one thing she hadn't counted on. People talk. Especially people who've been burned before. That same morning, a LinkedIn post from Bao Nguyen in Vietnam went live. No anger, no accusations. Just a photo of her empty factory floor, captioned, "We hired 26 new workers to meet Everstate's demands. Bought new machinery, shifted our entire operation. Yesterday, our contract was canceled without notice. We were told we were too complicated. It got 1,000 shares in 4 hours." Then came a post from Miguel Santos, showing a picture of his 3 daughters still in school uniforms helping load the last shipment they were ever going to send to the US. My girls thought they were building for the future. Now they're packing up a dream we were told had no more value. That post went viral. And then, the floodgates opened. Dozens of small business owners across Vietnam, Colombia, Nigeria, Poland, Malaysia, Taiwan began sharing their own stories. Stories of hope, of trust, of how they believed in a company that looked different, sounded different, and promised to be better, and then cut them off like they never mattered. Some told stories through photos, empty workstations, stacked boxes that would never be shipped. Others wrote open letters not just to Everstate, but to every corporation that ever treated partnership like charity and dignity like overhead. Within 24 hours, a journalist from a major tech ethics blog reached out to Bao. Within 48 hours, a nonprofit watchdog organization launched a probe into Everstate's procurement practices, citing systemic bias masked as cost optimization. And within 72 hours, a hashtag began trending. We were the supply chain. Thousands of comments poured in, from workers, from sons and daughters of small shop owners, from people who had seen this pattern repeat their entire lives. My dad lost his farm because of a canceled contract like this. My mom cried when our factory shut down. I was 10. I remember. They take what they need. Then they vanish. No thank you, no apology. And mixed in between those stories quietly but consistently was one name. Sophia. I never asked them to speak. I never told anyone what I had done. But somehow, they knew. Maybe it was the way I had looked them in the eye during those visits. Maybe it was because I never made promises I couldn't keep. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, someone from the other side had treated them like equals. Whatever the reason, they didn't just leave Everstate. They lit the beacon on the way out. And that was the part Victoria never saw coming. She thought her decisions would die quietly in a spreadsheet. But they were written in people's lives. And when those people decided to speak together, in one voice the silence became a roar. This wasn't just a supply chain issue anymore. It was a movement. And the board? They were starting to notice. The invitation came as a surprise. A calendar notification. No subject line. Just, Executive Emergency Session, 9 a.m., Boardroom A. I wasn't on the usual invite list. But this time, I was asked by name. When I stepped into the room, the energy was already tight. Quiet, but tense like the pause before a storm. 12 people around a long, polished table, suits, devices, bottled water untouched. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Pierce, the chairman of Everstate. He didn't greet me with a smile. He simply said, "Sophia, sit down. We need you to explain exactly what happened." Victoria was already there, hands folded, face stiff with something between confusion and disdain. She clearly hadn't expected me to be invited, and she certainly wasn't ready for what I brought with me. I opened my laptop. No dramatic speeches. No righteous anger. Just facts. Slide by slide, I walked them through what I'd built. Photos from supplier visits workshops in Colombia, precision labs in Querétaro, sustainable glassmakers in Portugal, videos of employees thanking Everstate for stable contracts, data on performance metrics, on time delivery, product quality, customer satisfaction, all exceeding our domestic vendors. Then came the numbers. $46.7 million in annual supply value, 18% cost reduction compared to domestic equivalents, 32% faster average fulfillment times, all from the vendors Victoria had labeled as unreliable. I showed them the withdrawal clause, clear, legal, binding. Highlighted the sections Victoria had skipped over. The signatures, the paper trail, the coordinated timeline. They leaned forward. Pierce rubbed his temple, the way people do when denial starts to collapse under weight. Victoria tried to interrupt. They were legacy contracts. Sophia never made me aware of any coordinated clauses. I turned the screen. displayed her approval emails, initials, datus, Herr Digital signature. The paper didn't lie. And then, I brought the room to silence. One final slide. Screenshots of the supplier posts that had gone viral. Photos. Captions. The hashtag. Number, we were the supply chain. I didn't need to editorialize. The stories spoke for themselves. But I looked up and said, quietly, these people trusted us. They hired workers, bought machinery, invested in us because I told them Everstate was different, and we were until someone decided different was inconvenient. Victoria snapped. They're emotional. They're small operations. They can't understand scale. Pierce's voice cut through the tension like glass. No, Victoria. It seems you didn't understand scale. Because you didn't just break contracts, you broke trust on a global level. He turned to me again. Sophia, in your opinion, can these relationships be salvaged? I didn't blink. Some, yes. But not if they believe the same leadership is still in place. They've asked for written assurance escultural protections, contract oversight, and that Victoria Lane no longer be involved in supplier relations. The room froze. Victoria stared at me like I had slapped her in front of the world. I didn't flinch. Because this wasn't personal. This was the result of choices. For 18 months, I said nothing. Took notes. Did the work. Watched. And now, finally, someone else was watching too. Not just the board, but the world. And the woman who once told me I was just here for optics was about to find out what happens when a quiet hire becomes the one voice they can't afford to ignore. It didn't happen in a dramatic firing. There was no yelling, no slamming of doors, no security escorting anyone out of the building. It happened the way real change often does, quietly, methodically, irreversibly. 3 days after the boardroom meeting, an internal memo circulated through Everstate's leadership channels. It was short. Formal. Final. Effective immediately, Victoria Lane will be transitioning to an advisory role focused on domestic operations. Interim leadership for international supplier relations will be overseen by Sophia Reyes. That was it. No headline. No grand announcement. Just a shift in structure subtle to outsiders, seismic to those who knew the truth. Victoria didn't speak to me that week. She kept to herself. Tucked away in corner offices. No longer hosting team calls. No longer smiling for internal videos about global growth. Her world had shrunk. The woman who once held entire departments in her palm now reviewed invoices and responded to procurement complaints from warehouse clients in Kansas and Ohio. Poetic, in a quiet kind of way. As for me, my days didn't change overnight. There were still emails, still vendor calls, still spreadsheets, timelines, budgets. But now, when I spoke, people listened. Now, when I made a decision, it didn't have to pass through 5 filters of indifference. And most importantly, now I could fix what had been broken. The first thing I did was call Bao in Vietnam. I told her the truth. We had a lot of rebuilding to do, and no guarantees. But we were going to lead with transparency this time and respect. She didn't say yes right away. But she didn't hang up either. That was enough. Then I reached out to Miguel, to the Santos daughters, who were still studying engineering, wondering if the dream their father built was worth salvaging. To the glassmakers in Porto, to the team in Bogota, to the polymer specialists in Thailand who hadn't shipped a unit since the cancellation. One by one, I asked the same question. What would it take not for you to come back but for you to believe in us again? Some asked for contract revisions. Others wanted oversight panels, escalation paths, clauses about ethical terminations, multilingual support, cultural training for procurement teams. I said yes to all of it, not out of guilt, but because they were right. They deserved what they'd been denied for too long. Recognition, protection, and a seat at the table. 6 weeks later, we held our first Global Partner Summit. Not in a ballroom, not in a PR-laced event hall. We hosted it virtually across 11 countries and 4 time zones. The first slide wasn't a corporate logo. It was a mosaic of every vendor's facility, their teams, their stories. The second slide read, "We don't just build tech, we build trust." I'm Zen, and I meant it. Because leadership isn't about control. It's about stewardship. It's about asking yourself every single day not what you can take, but what you're willing to earn. And I hadn't waited 18 months just to take Victoria's seat. I waited to prove that people like my mother, like Bao, like Miguel, were never the weak link. They were the foundation. They still are. And now finally, someone who understands that is the one calling the shots. People often think silence means weakness. That if you're not yelling, not fighting, not slamming your fist on the table, you're losing. But they're wrong. Silence is not the absence of power. It's the space where power is forged. The kind of silence I lived in wasn't passive. It was intentional. It was the kind of silence that observes more than it reacts. That listens while others expose themselves. That waits not because it doesn't know what to say, but because it knows when to say it. You see, when Victoria dismissed me as optics, when she called our global partners complicated, when she deleted livelihoods with a click and a shrug, I didn't respond with outrage. I responded with architecture. I built. I laid foundation beneath her arrogance, quiet, strategic, patient. Because I had learned, from a very young age, that loudness gets attention, but stillness builds structure. My mother taught me that. She didn't protest when they fired her. She didn't scream at the manager who said she wasn't a cultural fit. She just came home, pulled off her shoes, and looked at me like the world had cracked under her feet. But in that silence, something survived. Dignity. And I carried that with me. Every room I walked into, every contract I wrote, every smile I gave without revealing my thoughts. Because silence isn't just the space before sound. It's the space where people make choices that echo. And when the time came, when I finally spoke, the silence ended with clarity, not chaos. No insults, no threats, just truth. And that truth was louder than any outrage ever could be. Here's what I know now. You don't always have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to match someone's cruelty to undo their harm. You don't have to burn down the house to show them the foundation was never theirs to claim. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is build quietly while they underestimate you. Document what they dismiss. Remember what they forget. And when the moment comes, not take revenge, but restore balance. I didn't destroy Victoria. She destroyed herself one decision at a time. I just let the weight of her choices land exactly where they belonged. And maybe that's the lesson. That the people we overlook, the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones we assume won't fight back, are often the ones holding everything together. So if you're one of them, if you've ever felt ignored, dismissed, passed over, or told you're only there because someone needed to fill a box on a spreadsheet, don't let that be your ending. Let it be your beginning. Take notes. Ask better questions. Build systems they can't undo with a signature. And when the time comes to speak, speak with truth. Speak with purpose. Speak like someone who knows. You never needed to shout. You just needed to wait.